So again, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're joining us from, and very warm welcome on behalf of the New Directions team and on behalf of the British Council. My name is Elena. I'm a research assistant with the British Council, and I'm also program chair of the upcoming conference that's taking place in Hanoi in October. And in the lead up to this conference, the British Council has been organising a series of webinars that cover quite a wide range of topics that relate to this year's conference. And so I'm very pleased today to be joined by Meena Patel of the British Council. Meena really wears a lot of hats. She's an assessment researcher, and she's also a co-author of the Future of English Global Perspectives publication, but also has extensive and years-long experience as a teacher and a trainer. And so I'm sure we're all very excited today to hear about the future of English and its implications for teachers. Just a couple of housekeeping things. We have an hour for the webinar, and there's the opportunity to ask questions at the end. So please do post them throughout the session into the chat. You will have already noticed that your cameras and microphones are disabled, so we're only using the chat function today. And we'd also like to let you know that the webinar is being recorded. And the plus side of that is that we will upload it to YouTube afterwards, so you will have access again to the materials. And I think that's all from me. So without further ado, please welcome Meena.
Thank you very much, Elena. Just a sound check, you can hear me fine, is that right? Elena?
Yes.
Fantastic. Yes. Bear with me while I share my screen with you and get my PowerPoint up. Can everybody see that?
Yes, that's great.
Fantastic. Before I begin, absolute pleasure to be here in this pre-conference webinar for New Directions East Asia. Welcome to everybody who's joining, wherever you're joining from. One hat that Elena didn't mention, which is one of my loveliest hats, is Conference Chair for New Directions Latin America, which has just gone. So it's really nice for me to be able to be part of this conference in a more participatory level than an organisation level. Okay, so for those of you who know me, I am not a very formal presenter. I like a conversational style. I like to be interactive. So as Elena said, if you please do post questions in the chat, and I'll leave plenty of time for questions. And I'll also ask you questions throughout my presentation. So the idea of today's webinar is really just for me to provide a little bit of a springboard for us to begin a conversation, which I hope that we can continue in Hanoi in October. So I hope that's okay. So some of you may have heard about the Future of English programme. I think we've been talking about it for quite a while. Elena mentioned the publication that was launched in April. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the programme, just give you a brief overview. But more importantly, I'd like to talk about, from the data we collected, what are the implications for teachers on a very kind of general level, on a global level, and take it from there. So, doesn't go forward. Can't seem to move my PowerPoint on. Hold on a minute, sorry, let's try again. There we go. So what I'd like to cover today, I'd like to talk about English language teaching a little bit pre and post pandemic, because I think that has implications for teachers, obviously. I'd obviously like to talk about the Future of English programme, give you a little bit of an overview. I'd like to set our findings in the context of the comprehensive learning system, which was written about by Barry O'Sullivan in 2020. And then I would really like to focus on the implications for English language teachers from what the data tells us and from my perspective, but all up for discussion. So that's today. All right, very generally talking about English language teaching, I'm going to kind of set the scene pre-pandemic, if that's all right. So pre-pandemic, English language teachers have had access to various resources, course books. Doesn't matter where you are in the world, course books, whether they are international course books or locally created course books, they are the backbone of most English language teaching in the world. Many teachers have access to course books, so that's pretty much a given. Boards, be they blackboards, whiteboards, electronic boards, most teachers, again, not all, but most teachers have access to some kind of board to help them in the teaching process. The internet, even pre-pandemic, many teachers and learners were going to the internet to find resources or materials to help the processes going on in the classroom. Computer labs. In some countries, computer labs exist to support more traditional English language classroom. And by computer labs, I mean a classroom with rows and rows of computers where students can work individually or they can work in pairs on projects or tasks set by the teacher. Tablets. Increasingly, ministries of education are looking to tablets rather than laptops or computer labs to help students and teachers with the learning process, simply because tablets are more flexible and in some cases more efficient funding-wise than a computer lab. Mobile phones. Now more than ever, learners have access to mobile phones. They did pre-pandemic as well, and even pre-pandemic, teachers were using mobile phones in some contexts to communicate with students, to work with students in remote areas, but even in urban areas as well. So all of these resources were pretty much accessible pre-pandemic. Let's talk about methodology a little bit. So again, I am talking very, very generally. So methodology across the world is either teacher-centered, it's learner-centered or learning-centered, or a combination. The methodology a teacher uses in the classroom with students is dependent on, I think, two things generally. And this is my opinion. So it's dependent, number one, on the curriculum. Does your curriculum allow for the kind of methodology you want to use? But two, it also depends on the teacher and what the teacher believes about teaching and learning methodology for English language teaching. Assessment. Whether we like it or not, whether we admit it or not, a lot of English language teaching and classroom practice is assessment oriented. We help our students because we want them to achieve their goals in order to succeed in life, and a lot of achievements and goals have to have assessment in order to progress to the next level. So whether we like it or not, assessment is very important at the moment. Pre-pandemic, all of us were very comfortable and used to in-person teaching and learning. However, even pre-pandemic, online teaching and learning did exist. Blending learning, teaching and learning did exist, though it was in a few contexts and in some cases for specific purposes. Okay, so all of this in terms of methodology and resources happened pre-pandemic. So my first question to you as an audience is, what has changed? What has changed since the pandemic in terms of the availability of resources, in terms of the methodology that you use or you witness in the classroom? Please put your answers in the chat. I'm going to move on. So then the pandemic came along. Who could have predicted it? I think in the media, one or two people said they did predict it, but really, who could have predicted what actually happened to us in the last few years? Who can predict the future? I know there are lots of answers to this, but that was a rhetoric question. David Graddol thought that he could predict the future of English language over the next 15 years. In 2006, he published English Next, where he made predictions for the future of the English language. Over the next 15 years, he made 14 predictions. And David Graddol is the starting point for the Future of English programme. So let me tell you a little bit about it. The project objectives are broad and they're quite high level. So we hope that the project will aim to provide insights on trends that will define the role of English as a global language over the next decade or so. So what we're interested in is what is happening with English? How are people using it? What is the status of English in different parts of the world? And I'll come back to that in just a second. We hope that our findings can inform language policy and education and reform interventions. So we hope that what we find will be useful for education systems. And very importantly, we don't see the Future of English programme as a one-off, just not a drop in the ocean. We see it as a long-term programme in which we're laying out a research agenda. We want to generate evidence and the methodology to continue tracking the use of English. And so long term, to be able to inform policy decisions, but also to evaluate the impact of these decisions. So these are quite high level objectives, but within the 3 objectives, obviously, there are more smaller, more focused, more contextual objectives, and that's really important to remember. So there are 3 main phases of this project. So phase 1 is we evaluated Graddol's predictions. We did this through desk research, but we also did it through a small survey. We wanted to see, well, you know, of his 14 predictions, where did we get to? Where are we now? For me, one of the biggest findings here was that actually there aren't any reliable statistics out there. There isn't any reliable data about what is happening with English, who uses English. We know that there are over 2 billion speakers of English around the world. We don't know very much about them. We know that many of them English is a second language. We know that many of them use it as a contact language in multilingual situations, but actually there isn't very much hard, robust data out there. But anyway, from what we found, we came out with 16 predictions of our own. But there were our predictions based on Graddol. So we thought, well, actually, we need to talk to people on the ground. We need to find out what's really happening around the world. So what we did is we decided to organise regional roundtables and actually ask people that we work with who are involved in English language education and education generally what they thought. And I'll tell you a little bit about that in a moment. And at the moment, we are in phase 3, so we are in the process of developing a long-term research agenda. Some research has already begun around the findings from our roundtable discussions, but we are at the moment in phase 3. What I'm going to tell you about now a little bit is phase 2. So we organised 14 roundtable discussions across 49 countries and territories, and we talked to 92 policymakers and policy influencers. Now, the question that we get asked very often is, why didn't you talk to teachers? So we started with policymakers and policy influencers because we wanted an overview. We wanted an overview of national, regional policies and practice so that we can get a global oversight. Now, we know that we need to talk to teachers. We know that we need to talk to young people. We know that we need to talk to a whole variety of stakeholders. But with any kind of research, particularly qualitative research, you have to start somewhere. You have to start at a point where you know that you will get the kind of information that you're looking for about the areas that you are researching. And that's why we started with policymakers. Now, each roundtable lasted for about 2 hours. So you can imagine 14 roundtables, 2 hours long, and each roundtable between 5 to 7 policymakers. So that is an incredibly rich amount of data that we gathered. And as I said at the beginning, most of the people we talked to were to do with English language teaching, but not all of them. They came from all areas of education, which we thought was really important because English is not an island. It doesn't exist on its own, which is a wonderful, wonderful thing, actually. So this is where our data came from. Now, when we started analysing the data, and we didn't do this on our own, British Council worked with a company called Trajectory, who specialise in futures methodology. So we worked with them on the analysis. We soon realised that actually we weren't in any position to make predictions simply because from the information that was coming out from the data, it was obvious that there were more more questions that needed to be answered. And in order to make predictions, we did need more data. So we went from kind of the idea of, yes, we'll have new predictions, to a new set of themes or questions around which more work was needed. So the result of Future of English Global Perspectives, the publication that we've talked about, there are 8 thematic questions which are the main findings. So will English remain the world's most sought after language? What role will English play in our multilingual reality? What is the future of English as a medium of education? How will teachers remain relevant in future English language learning systems? Public and private English language provision, who has the answers? Can English language assessment meet stakeholders' changing needs? Can technology narrow the equity gap in English language education? And to what extent is employment driving the future of English? Now, these are 8 very, very broad areas, but that is what came out of the data globally. It is these 8 areas that we think will impact the future of English language learning and education as we move forward. So you can imagine that in these 8 areas, there are still a lot of questions to be asked. And within the 8 areas, there will be different resonance and relevance for different contexts around the world. So, as well as these 8 areas, I keep saying 3, I don't know why. Within these 8 areas, there are 3 very important .
Mina, I think you've muted yourself. Can you unmute yourself?
Sorry, that was an accident in trying to get my slides working.
No worries.
Okay, so within these 8 areas, there are 3 common threads that run through, that underpin all of them. One is education policy. So it really doesn't seem to matter what resources are available or what teachers believe, because most of what happens in the classroom is dictated by education policy. Policy is one of those things that sometimes teachers don't have control over, but education policy is incredibly important and runs all the way through. Something wrong with the PowerPoint. Sorry, I do apologise, but I'm going to have to end show and do it again for some reason. Okay, I'm going to keep clicking. The other 2 threads are stakeholders. So in our data, one of the things that came out is that in planning English language learning and teaching, whether it's on the classroom level, whether it's an institution level or a national policy level, we need to be talking to more stakeholders. As I said, English language teaching it doesn't happen in isolation. There are lots and lots of perspectives and voices and investments involved, and we need to be including all of those voices when we make decisions about English language teaching and learning. And one of the most important stakeholders that came out from our data were parents. The other thread that came out was equality, diversity, inclusion. Really, really important. Obviously, we all know that. And in many conversations about English language teaching and learning, EDI, as we call it, has a space, it has a role, it has a voice. But in terms of implementation and operationalization, it's a different matter. How does it actually happen? How do we actually do it in different contexts? So those were the 3 main threads that ran through the 8 areas that came out of the data. However, these 8 areas that are very interesting and these common threads, they do not happen in a vacuum. Everybody we talk to in the round tables, or the policymakers and influencers we talk to, they operate in a context. They operate in a context that is a social context, an educational context, and a political context. And that context is made up of lots and lots of stakeholders, as I just said. And within that context, we have education, we have a learning system that teachers and students and decision makers operate within. The Comprehensive Learning System by O'Sullivan 2020 suggests that in order for teaching and learning to be successful or have a chance to be successful and effective, the learning system has to operate with a single philosophy. It has to be underpinned by standards. And the three corners of this triangle, curriculum, assessment, and delivery, have to work together in order to achieve success or try to achieve success. And if one of the corners of this triangle are a little bit off kilter, the learning system will not be achieving as much as we want it to do. And the biggest impact obviously will be on our learners. So the idea that our 8 areas that came out of the data have an impact on this learning system is really important. So the context, as I said, is incredibly important because not all of the 8 areas will resonate equally in each learning context. And when I talk about learning context, again, we're looking at different levels. We're looking at national levels. We're looking at regional levels, but we're also looking at local levels. Because as we all know, context can change within countries as well as across borders. Right, English language teachers, what are the implications for English language teachers around the world? Well, our data tells us that teachers will still be at the heart of the teaching and learning process, even with all the technological advances. I think bar 2 people, everyone in our data set said teachers are key and they're critical and they're important, which is great news. However, there are concerns, 2 main concerns. One, are there enough English teachers? In some places in the world, there really aren't. But secondly, are there enough skilled English teachers? 2 slightly different things, but 2 things that actually have huge importance globally. Technology. Everybody's talking about technology at the moment, but where teachers are concerned, can they work effectively with it? Do they like it? Do they have the training to be able to work with it? How do they manage technology and their own skills, knowledge and expertise with that of their students? So technology is great and it can be an enabler, but there are questions I think that we need to think about, but also technology isn't available equally in all contexts. So again, that needs to be thought about as well. And importantly, development and training for teachers. This came out really, really strongly in the data. Is there enough development and training? Is it the right development and training? These are massive, massive questions. Does development and training translate into practice? These are huge questions, but going back to the first finding, teachers are really important. So these are questions that need to be addressed moving forward. So factors that influence the role of the teacher. So when people said to us, you know, teachers are important, there are factors that do influence how important teachers are that the agency teachers have. Policy. Policy dictates the course books that we use, the curriculum, sometimes the methodology. So there are things that teachers, maybe on a day-to-day basis, cannot influence. They have to work with. But nonetheless, the things that we work with influences what happens in the classroom. The learner has a massive influence on what happens in the classroom. Now, one thing that came out in the data is that learners have changed. Learners have changed a little bit since the pandemic. They are more aware of opportunities and possibilities of what's out there for them. They're more aware of the different platforms that learning can happen on. They're more aware of their teachers. And for the people we talk to, we were told that learners are more engaged. Now, again, I realise that this is different context to context, but I'm giving you a general overview. So the learner has changed. But for me, the biggest thing that influences what happens in the classroom and the role of the teacher is the teacher herself or himself. The teacher is the biggest influence in the classroom, I believe. Teacher beliefs. For me, it doesn't matter really what the policy might be. It doesn't matter what the resources that a teacher has available. It really doesn't matter, though it is very important, the training and development a teacher has. Teacher beliefs, what teachers believe about the teaching and learning process and education generally is the biggest influence in the classroom, because teachers will teach and they will help their students learn in relation to what they believe about the process. And that belief we may or may not have articulated, but it exists. So I believe that teachers need to start thinking about what they believe about the teaching and learning process. And this is something that very often, even in teacher training and development programs, teachers aren't asked to do. And when I do training, this is one of the first things I ask teachers to do. What do you believe about the process? Or if you have thought about it, revisit it regularly. Our beliefs shape our classroom practice. And what we need to do, I think, is to use our beliefs to review what we do in the classroom regularly. And the reason I say regularly is because we all know that we live in a dynamic, changing environment. English language teaching policies can change very, very quickly. New resources are brought in. Now we have technology. Now everybody's talking about ChatGPT. Things are changing all the time. So we need to review quite regularly what happens in the classroom. And then we need to use our evaluation of our own practice to take ownership of our own development and to drive our own change. So what I'm saying is there is a role for policy and decision makers. There is a role for professional development that is institution-led or education system-led. But I think there is a role for teachers actually to take their development in their own hands. There is an incredible amount available online now. And I think that teachers need to drive their own change based on their own beliefs, based on their classroom practice, which obviously will be context-led to shape their professional development. And I think now is the time for this to happen. I think teachers, I believe, have never had so much agency as they do now. And I think depending on what you believe about the teaching and learning process, now is a good time for all teachers. I'm going to stop there. If you want to read a bit more about our data and findings in our book, there's a QR code there. I'm happy to talk more, but I would actually like to leave some time for questions. So I'm going to stop sharing, pause there for a minute and take some questions.
Thank you so much, Mina. That was really lovely to hear all of that, really practical information with a really lovely background of, well, what the future of English does and what it means for teachers. We had a couple of comments in response to your very first question when you talked about it. Do you want me to read some out for that?
Yes, please.
So Louise said that the learners are more aware of the resources that are available to them, which is actually something that you just mentioned as well at the very end. She's saying that digital literacy skills among students and teachers have developed, which is also a very interesting comment. And further, someone from the Indonesian context is saying that teachers in Indonesia are starting to learn how to create a virtual classroom, and the students are trying to adapt to the new strategy and method relating to online learning. So again, I think it's about these resources that are available to them, isn't it?
Yes. Can I just jump in there? I think that's a really, really nice comment, because what that tells me is that teachers and learners are actually collaborating together in order to shape what that teaching and learning environment looks like. And just to throw in here, so we did a session at the IATEFL conference in Harrogate in April, I believe, and we did ask some educators what they saw a future learning system looking like. And it was exactly that. It was a collaboration, not so much, you know, here's the course book, here's what I'm going to take you through today, here's the objectives, which is all great and can work very, very well. But more of, you know what, this is what we need to achieve. How are we going to do it together? So I really like that. Thank you for sharing that. Who from Indonesia, right?
From Indonesia, yes.
Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah, and
Lovely.
I think it speaks very well to the triangle that you're presenting ultimately, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
And we have one question from Jean Anthony from the Philippines. And he...
I hear you.
Oh.
I've got you back.
No. Okay, wonderful. I've got a question from Jean Anthony from the Philippines who's saying, in the Philippines, where English is our second language and integrated into our educational curriculum, do you think that integrating the English language in educational system could be a leverage for the students to be globally competitive? Or could this also be a threat to displace our mother tongue? A very relevant question, I think, which came up a lot throughout the future of English as a program on its own.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. So one of the themes, as you saw, was the role of English in a multilingual reality. At the moment, English is the global lingua franca. It is kind of the contact language for many, many people around the world. So I think it is important, not only on a global level to connect people across borders and across nations, but I think it's important in kind of regional and local contexts as well, because of the role that it plays in just connecting people with a common language. In terms of it being part of the national curriculum or the education system, many, many countries have English as part of their language and education policy, and I think that's fine. But really, it goes back to how is it being taught? What are the students achieving? Because I have examples, I'm not going to name countries, but I have examples of countries who have had English in their education system for many years, and yet their learners cannot really use the language in any meaningful way. So one of the things that came out in the data that I didn't talk about is that the nature of how English is being used is changing. It's more instrumental. Young people need English to do things. So if your curriculum supports that, if we're using English in a very instrumental way in order to achieve young people's goals, then I think, yes, it's a great way to go. It really is a great way to go. But, and this is something that is a passion of mine, I think decision makers have to really, really balance English with local languages. They really do, because local languages are so important. All languages are so important. And I think that learners need to feel comfortable in their own language or local languages, as well as English. And there were quite a few examples in our data where local languages were feeling threatened by English. But really, I think that's driven top down sometimes by education policy, but also ground up with parents wanting their children to do well on the global stage and thinking that English is the way to go, which it can be, but not at the expense of local languages, I believe.
So it's again all about the balance.
It is about, yeah.
Yes.
And it's not an easy balance.
Do you want to comment on what this person from the Philippines was asking about being globally competitive? Does English, what role does English continue to play in that?
I think at the moment it does play a very big role in being globally competitive. I mean, the number of multinational companies that have English as their official language of business is massive. A lot of, somebody in our roundtables told us that 90% of the research during the pandemic was in English. So if globally competitive means having access to the knowledge and resources in order to achieve success in whatever it is you want to do, then yes, my answer is yes.
Very interesting. And coming back to something you just said about the more practical context in which English is being taught, that is something that we had earlier on as a comment from Louise as well when we talked about COVID. She was saying that there's a greater understanding of a flipped classroom approach and the desire of students to focus more on practice in class. So it's a desire from the students as well that the teachers are responding to there.
Yeah. And I think that's a testament to teachers, that students understand that need to practice with teachers and get that feedback. And I think that if students are saying this, I think that's amazing. So good on you, teachers. Go for it.
We have a question from Marcus. It's in relation to technology, and he's asking, it's a very, very relevant question. Should a teacher avoid mentioning ChatGPT when referring to lesson planning in class? He's saying, I guess it comes down to the teacher belief aspect that you mentioned earlier. And he's giving an example. So if a student uses AI to make a presentation in class and admits this,
I think it says it can lead.
yes, sorry. It can lead to resentment from peers. Sometimes you look at something and you can't figure it out. Could a teacher be at risk from experiencing the same if they're transparent also? So very interesting, very relevant question.
Can I just look at the question before the example? So should a teacher avoid using Okay, so you won't be surprised that I probably get asked this question at least once a day, right? ChatGPT technology, all very, very amazing. But I think two things. We need to know how the technology works so we can effectively use it. But two, we need to know its limitations, right? And I think that being transparent in class with your students, I think is the way to go. Because one of the most important things in the classroom, and you all know this, is trust, right? And to ignore something like ChatGPT in today's environment, if your students are asking about it, if you're using it, I think it would be a mistake not to say, it's here and we can work with it. But it is a tool. It is a tool, just like we have other tools. I keep talking about course books, but handouts, like phones, like the blackboard, the whiteboard, the electronic board. It's a tool. So I think the trick is, how can we leverage this tool to more effectively meet the outcomes that we want in the classroom? And I think it's about having a conversation with your students, because a lot of what comes out in our findings is awareness raising of what's out there, awareness raising of what is possible, awareness raising of limitations. And that's the same for different languages as well. Saying, we're learning English, but we're learning it for this purpose. That doesn't mean that your language or any other language is less or not important. So I think it's about going back to creating a collaborative learning environment where, you are open with your students, you converse with your students, and you the teaching and learning is a shared co-constructive process. I hope that answers your question, Marcus.
I hope so too. It was a really great question and a great answer. And it's about AI literacy ultimately as well, isn't it? It's a very tricky subject for sure. Marcus says thank you. Yeah.
Oh, did he? Okay. Can I just make a point on literacies? Because that's something that is popping its head up more and more and more. So we have digital literacy, we have AI literacy, we have assessment literacy. We have quite a few literacies being bandied around, and I think they're really important. But what does literacy or having a certain kind of literacy actually mean? And I think sometimes knowing about how something works, so knowing about something, knowing about AI, and knowing how to use the AI for the benefit for the classroom are two different things. And I think for me, as you well know, Elena, I'm not hugely technological. So my kind of technological literacy is very, very minimal. I'm more interested in how can I use this to help me? And I think that's the way that teachers should look at it as well. Obviously, but I'm sure there are more teachers who are more AI literate than me.
Well, it again speaks to that the context needs to be the appropriate one, or rather that we need to take into account the immediate context. We've got another question that's again a more practical one and relates to course materials. We're being asked, will conventional worksheets, lesson materials, activities such as multiple choice, fill in the blank, recording words, etc., still be relevant with all the technology and teaching and learning transformation that we're experiencing?
I love this question. It's a great question. Thank you very much. So when I was heavily involved in teacher training, and that's really where my heart is, one of the things I always used to say in my sessions, variety. Variety is the spice of life. So I think, no, worksheets, lesson materials, activities, all of the things you've said there, I don't think they will become irrelevant because we can do them with technology, but there is a role for kind of tactile things in the classroom. There is a role for paper and pens, and there is a role for working together. So I think, no, they won't disappear, because in some contexts, if I'm really, really honest, that's all teachers still have. They don't have access to technology. They don't have access. And if they have a phone or a tablet, they may not have the connectivity. And if they have a phone and tablet, it might be 2 or 3 students in the class. So I don't think it will disappear, because I think that the spread of technology will take its time across the world. But I think variety is the key. Technology, technology, technology. If I was in a classroom, I'd get bored. The same as I would get bored if you kept saying to me, open your course book at page 61. Let's do exercise A, B, and C or something. So variety, and no, it won't. Reordering words, one of my favorite activities in the classroom. Please don't stop doing it. Kids love it. Kids love it. So that was my answer to that.
Yeah, so it's about the appropriate use and the thought, and putting thought into how to use technology. We don't currently have any other questions. Do you have any other comments at all? Any summarizing feedback? Any questions for the audience?
Can I just see? Yes, I have a question. Hold on, there is a great understanding of a flipped classroom approach and the desire for students to focus more on practicing. Yeah, okay. Yes, I have a question for the audience, if that's all right. So in terms of future learning systems in your context, because I know you all come from different contexts, what do you think will be the biggest change? Is it going to be in methodology? Is it going to be in assessment? Is it going to be in the role of the teacher? What are those, of those 3 things, what do you think is going to be the biggest change in the next 10 years or so? Is it going to be methodology? Is it going to be assessment? And when I say methodology, I link that to curriculum, assessment, or the role of the teacher. But you can just put something in the chat, that would be great. And there are no right or wrong answers. This is just your opinion. Thanks, Elena.
Well, the role of the teacher has come up a few times already. Can you see the chat, Mina?
I'm looking at it now.
Louise says hybrid learning, which is not one of your lists, but
that's okay. But that's to do with methodology, right? That's to do with methodology. So yeah, that's good.
I'll also say, if someone wants to raise their hand, we can activate your camera and your microphone. So if someone really wants to speak, you can raise your hand with the raise hand function. We'd really love to speak to you.
Yes. Say hello.
Dave Allen has a very good contribution there.
Hello, Dave Allen.
He's saying, yeah, it's going to be technology allowing us to properly link assessment and teaching and learning.
I agree with you, Dave, but if we have the technology and if we have the training to support that technology, but I do agree with you. Greater learner independence. Okay, good. Again, in order to help our learners be independent, we need to know how to do that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Your camera shy. I don't believe you for a minute. Hi, Dave. I hope you're well.
He's agreeing with you.
He is agreeing with me.
That's wonderful.
Can I just ask where Andrew's from? He says he thinks the biggest change will be greater learning independence. If you're speaking for your context, where are you from, Andrew?
Oh, Hong Kong.
Hong Kong. Okay, great. Louise has put a comment in. Hello, Louise. I would like to think assessment will change to meet all the challenges you've mentioned, but I'm not convinced education policies with. So one of the things, I talked a little bit about literacies. So one of the things at the moment, Louise, that I'm really interested in policy literacy. So I put my hand up. I do say, oh, policymakers should do this and policymakers should do this, and why don't they do that? But I think there is a role for educators and academics to learn a bit more about the factors that influence policy making, because I don't think it's that easy. I'm sure none of us think it's that easy. And speaking to your comment, I think even if they do agree with us, I wonder how easy it is to implement change like that, if that makes sense. So I often think that I do give policymakers a bad press, and maybe I shouldn't, before I understand what is behind the scenes and what goes into those decisions that they make. But yes, good point.
And she's asking as a follow-up, how do we build across this communication gap?
Well, that is a $6 million question, and that is something I think that the Future of English programme will be looking at over the next couple of years, definitely, because there is a gap there. You are right. You are completely right. So how do we make our research accessible and relevant to those people who make the decisions, basically? Yeah, agree.
Okay, we've had some great questions and some great comments. Is there anything else you want to add, Mina?
I'm going to ask Louise a question, or everybody else a question. Can we all answer Louise's question and help me?
Yeah.
If anybody has any answers to Louise's questions, that would be great. But I see that Dave's got his hand up.
He does, yes. I'm going to see if I can. I'm going to allow mic and I'm going to allow camera. I wonder if that's worked. Dave, can you hear us? I think you should be able to speak now if you unmute your own mic. Wonderful.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, hi.
Hi, Mina. Hi, Elena. Given the fact that the kind of things that I guess we'd all like to see in the areas we've just been talking about, if they're going to take place, it's going to need the support of large organizations to help to make them happen. What can you share with us about what the British Council is doing, and particularly in the area of assessment, in the right direction?
That's a really good question. So in terms of in the area of assessment, we are looking at different AI possibilities. We are exploring artificial intelligence, not to immediately implement, because research, as you know, takes time. But we're looking at two things. We're looking at the AI space and seeing what the possibilities are to make assessment more accessible in so many ways to more people. So good, robust assessment, how do we make it possible to more people? That's one thing we're doing. But the other thing we're doing, we're also doing some work around Barry's triangle around the teaching, the curriculum, the delivery and assessment, and really working with our teachers to think about how do we not leave assessment to the end, and how do we not leave it out the loop? How do we integrate it and build it in to everyday teaching and learning processes? And there's a really nice project working with our secondary students that we're doing. So the assessment research group is working with teaching centres, and I think there are a couple of papers out there, and Dave, I can send those to you. So we're working on the triangle, but also kind of looking at AI and how we can help larger audiences, as you say. But your question also links to one of the themes that came out of the book, which is the private sector and the public sector working together. How can we kind of integrate knowledge, experience, expertise and resources in order to better help more people? I hope that helps.
Yep, nice encouraging answer, and thanks for a good session.
Thank you so much. Lovely to see you, Dave.
Cheers.
Thank you, Dave. Louise had a follow-up comment to the question about the communication gap, and it is giving teachers a visible platform, which I'm sure you agree with, Mina.
I do. Louise, we can talk about this in depth for hours and hours if you ever have the time.
I'm sure. Okay, well, we've got about 10 minutes left of the session. Mina, is there anything else you want to share with the audience?
Elena, is it worth sharing our inbox address in case people want to talk to us about the future of English or have any questions or comments?
Yes, we can do that. I'll put it in the chat.
Thank you so much. So if you do want to keep in touch with us about this programme, if you'd like to know more, if you have comments that maybe you don't want to put here, but you want to just follow up with me, I think Elena's just going to put an email address in the chat. And just to say, and I will stop after this, Elena, just to say that we will be picking some of this conversation up in the threads up in Hanoi at New Directions. So looking forward to that, and just to say thank you for everybody's attention and participation today. I've really enjoyed it. Hope it's been useful in some way, and thank you for having me.
Thank you so very much, Mina, for your own time today, and thank you to all of you for engaging and for participating and for asking great questions and for answering some questions as well. There's just a couple of final words from me. I'm going to share my slide again. All the windows always disappear when you start sharing, don't they? So we already said that this is part of a webinar series, and this is leading up to the New Directions East Asia conference that Mina just mentioned again as well. This is happening in Hanoi in October, and we of course hope to see many of you there, maybe attending, maybe even presenting, because we're still accepting proposals until the end of this week. And you can have a look at our call for proposals by scanning the QR code. And then I also want to point to another webinar that's planned as part of the series that's going to happen in just a couple of months' time. We'll be joined by Graddol, our colleague, who will be presenting on young learners assessment and technology. And then lastly, we'd love to hear what you thought of the session today, so please share your feedback. And when you do share your feedback and fill in the form, you'll also have the opportunity to enter your email address, and you'll receive a certificate of your attendance and participation of today's webinar. And I think Neil just put the link to this form into the chat as well, so you can use that too. And that's all from me. Thank you so very much again, Mina, for all your insights and for all your very wise words. And thank you to everyone else too. Have a really lovely rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Elena. Thanks, Neil, in the background. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.